So Sumitra is the Global Partnerships Director at Ashoka. Some of you may know Ashoka. It's this group of change makers around the world. I think there's 4,000 of us, right? And she's the one who builds the partnerships, connects the dots between Asia, Asia Pacific, Europe, North America, etc., etc. She's quite masterful. I've been always in awe of watching her do her thing. And so I thought, who shall we ask to share with us? And I thought of Sumi. So I wanted to make it easy for her because I know she's busy. And I just said, well, I'll just share what does facilitative leadership mean to you, Sumi, and why is it needed in the world today? So we'll just hear you talk, and then we may have some questions from the floor, and then just chat a little bit.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Cynthia. I feel and all of you for having me. Funnily enough, I'm actually calling from KL today. I'm actually Malaysian, of Malaysian origin, from KL. Sorry, Cynthia?
Usually based in Singapore.
Yeah, usually I'm in Singapore, and so it feels strangely poetic to be able to do this with you today. As I said, I'm Malaysian born. I'm fourth generation Malaysian. I like to say Malayan, because my family straddles both Singapore and Malaysia. And I grew up very much like most Malaysians, and particularly growing up in a city, in a very, very multiracial environment, very diverse, creative, playful. And I really cherish. It always easy, but it's the same as everyone around us. So that was quite typical. The bit that I realized last year in some of the work that I was doing, I had a real awakening. When I was 17 years old, to advance my studies because my family wouldn't have been able to afford it, a really important person who was the gatekeeper to many of the government scholarships said to me, "You are not one of us." To a 17-year, did you hear that? Yeah, you are not one of us, right? And I didn't realize till I was 49 years old that had a really dramatic effect on me in terms of creating a sense of belonging, right? My whole world for 17 years was seeing myself as a rooted, grounded Malaysian. I was 4 generations, I had family stories for 4 generations of being Malaysian. And to be told at 17 years old, when you're all wide-eyed and the world is your oyster and you can do whatever you like, that you're not one of us, was just life-changing, right? And in a way, now that I look back and age gives you the benefit of that, I realized that forced me to really think differently and to do differently. And therefore, long story short, I managed to overcome that. And I was able to take up my place in this great university that completely changed my life. And so then the next 10, 15 years, I was in Europe doing a lot of innovation work, a lot of work around 2 things: innovation, new ways of doing things, And the other intersection was relationships. All of it was through partnership. A lot of the work that I was doing, and it was all in private sector, right? So we were in this private sector environment. I was in this R&D environment, and I was bringing new ideas and new ways of working, always in partnership. Not easy, but it was a very exciting space that was growing. And there was a lot of support for new ideas and innovation. You know, rich countries in Europe, US, the global North, there's a lot of wealth for new ideas and innovation. For those of us from the South and developing countries, innovation is very, very difficult, right? So when I came back about 15, 16 years ago I decided to stay in Singapore. With my family, my young family, I became a social entrepreneur, maybe many of you. And I was still really passionate, like all of you, around, I was in my 30s then, really passionate, like all of you, around changing systems and bringing new ideas into the system. And the idea I was working on and my organization was very, very focused on children and young people and the education system in Singapore. And that was the next phase, like how do you bring innovation and change the life trajectory of a child growing up? And my challenge then, I noticed, even in Singapore and to this day, is that people didn't want to change things. People were happy with the status quo. And there was very little understanding there was fear actually in the system for new ways of doing. And there still is, very much so. So I'd come from an environment, and this is what, I'll keep coming back to the themes, new ways of doing, new ways of relating, happening in Europe and the US and the global North. But when you come back, and I was in Singapore, and this was about 15 years ago, the resistance to new ways of doing things in education system was significantly high. And what was even more difficult was I found funders and partners struggled with giving more resources to innovative innovations. So people like to think, wow, Singapore, there's so much money, there's so much funders, but they were not releasing the funding. They were releasing a lot of funding and partnerships with universities. But for new ideas, new ways of doing things, new solutions, they were very, very skeptical, And so my own organization, I was banging my head a little bit against the wall, like, you do these exciting pitches and you're pushing, but you're not getting anywhere, right? So that's when I joined Ashoka. So Ashoka, as Cynthia pointed out, is a global organization focused on social innovation, social entrepreneurs. And the first thing I learned from Bill, he's just a genius in some ways, Bill Drayton, the founder, is he had the simple idea that he believed every one of you, citizens, everyday citizens, could take action to solve problems. We don't just need big NGOs and governments to do that. Civil society has a role to play. And how do we unlock that, right? And so he said, the simple idea is make the change you want to see visible, right? And so he elected Ashoka Fellows, and that's how I met Cynthia. And we decided to elect, and it was really pleasant because I joined Ashoka to make systems change and innovation visible, right? To make that more visible. People were not going to believe me if I belonged to a small little organization I started in Singapore. The field needed to be lifted. And so I joined Ashoka, and then they said, well, actually, we're struggling. We don't have a team here yet in Singapore or Malaysia. Can you help us revamp and build up the organization, including Indonesia? So super grateful when we went out and looked for social entrepreneurs. Cynthia joined us. Cynthia was nominated by Harry Jonas. Some of you might know him. And that was the start. We started making visible and connecting the light bulbs in Southeast Asia that were driving big change. Now, just to clarify there, Ashoka has been in Southeast Asia for 40 years. We've been driving, so our social entrepreneurs have been driving change for 40 years, in particularly Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. Cynthia and Johnson Uy and Sedunia in KL are the first two Malaysians. And there are another 2 or 3 in Singapore. But with Singapore, then the next thing we noticed, so we noticed lack of appetite for innovation. But now we found these great light bulbs, these organizations like Cynthia, like all of you. What you do is just amazing. But there are also another 200 in Indonesia, 10 in Philippines, 100 in Thailand. We said, well, how can we help? How can we drive bigger change? And then we discovered that actually most of these organizations that have been around for 40 years have been left unsupported. They have been striving very much on their own, pushing the water uphill to try and create change. And because our political systems in most of these countries are highly unstable, Indonesia has been stable the last 10 years, Philippines is still struggling, and except for Thailand, there wasn't a funding ecosystem or a collective impact system. The first system I saw of collective impact was actually in KL with YTL and several other foundations, right? The Malaysians were actually very advanced in bringing people together across silos, across sectors, holding spaces for conversation. What was missing was big ideas, audacious ideas, the kind of work that you do, right? That is still missing. But at least people are more collaborative. But the rest of Southeast Asia, it's not. It's quite siloed. And in Singapore, where you have close to 100 billion, there's a platform that has 50 philanthropists that belong to it. It commands $100 billion in wealth through their businesses. They're still making very small moves. So we have a disparity, right? We have you guys, the social entrepreneurs, the young change makers, making these bold moves and doing a lot and creating shifts and coming up with ideas, but you didn't have the other side of the ecosystem. We don't have the other side of the ecosystem to actually say, to walk down this road, the social change journey with you, right? And to achieve these big goals, right? So I was very frustrated. And the problem with that is power is then, as you all know, power is then not equally distributed. Power is then not in the hands of the people. Power is then not in the hands of the very people creating change, the communities, the indigenous communities, but power is still in the hands of the wealth maker. So now in this role in Ashoka, and I tried pushing and pushing and pushing, and eventually we raised money, but because they didn't understand systems change, they didn't understand innovation, they didn't understand facilitative leadership. That's still a difficult one for people. They really don't get the need for it. And the need for results and impact in the short term is very, very high. And I, we kept pushing and pushing, and it was very hard work, very, very hard work. And, at one point I even burnt out, like in 2017, it was actual burnout, because people were not getting it. And there was this huge level of pushing, the yin and the yang was not flowing. There was no flow, a lot of pushing. So the thing that's unpacking for me is, in terms of facilitative leadership, is a couple of things. I mean, even before we go into that, a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago, I said, well, I don't get it. You've got a group of people with great ideas and great solutions, but how come there isn't as much funding and partnership and support to make those great ideas visible? And that's when I started looking and working on my own inner journey. I started in 2018 because I was quite burnt out on working on my own inner journey and my own reason why that I'm doing this stuff, what actually gets me here and why am I excited about this? And I'm still on that journey. It's taken me 5 years. But it's becoming very, very clear to me that our inner work, our inner sense of who we are matters, right? And where are we acting from? Are we acting from our sense of strength, or are we acting from this deep trauma that I encountered from before? Did I start my organization because I wanted to belong? Did I start my organization because I wanted ego and titles and to be seen as the person doing the change? Where was I acting from? And how do I interact with these funders and partners and resource providers in a way that is benevolent, that generates more rather than sucks energy away, right? Generates more energy for them and energy for me, right? So that's the inner work that I think is quite important. And I think that inner work, then we are hoping influence. So that's when we launched this initiative together with Cynthia and a few others, Inner Discovery for Impact, to try and bring philanthropists together with social entrepreneurs. So why am I going in a sort of a long about story to express this journey? And I think age gives you the benefit of looking at your life again over 25 years. I think for me, facilitative leadership requires 3 things. One is our inner sense of who we are and what we're doing and what's motivating and what's the intrinsic motivation that we have behind the work. And this will affect how we relate to others, as well as our expectations around results and outcomes. What matters is the dharma, the calling, the effort. But what emerges, we might have to let go of. The second thing is we need to bring more unusual allies into every space of conversation. So again, for me, facilitative leadership is, as I said, listening to yourself and then listening and relating to others. But the second element is who's the unusual ally for me, right? Who I have struggled to bring it onto the table. And so for the work that I've tried to do is to bring more and more philanthropists and funders and resource providers to the table with all of you, right? So that they can see differently, think differently, and do differently. And at the moment, it is not happening as much as it should be happening. Whether it's at a country level or whether it's at a regional level. Singapore has so much concentration and power, but the extent that civil society has a seat at the table, as that isn't happening as much as it should. So for me, facilitative leadership is bringing those unusual allies into every conversation, and so that they point to the things that we don't know. What we don't know, we don't know. Otherwise, we're stuck in an echo chamber. And you guys are the experts of all of this. All of you are such great heroes in bringing communities together. So I guess the conversation is, who is unusual for you, right? And how do you bring them into your space? And if we are really looking at deep, systemic, innovative space, how do we make that visible to them? right? How do we make them visible that, you know, indigenous voices matter? How do we make that visible that civil society matter, right? So those are the things, because then only can we shift and build big ideas, in my mind, in my humble mind. The third thing is most of the civil society, you guys have done such a terrific job. You are in the 1%, I think, in the region that have driven large-scale change, but you are in the minority. For most social entrepreneurs in civil society, they have struggled to achieve large-scale change. And that's not because the ideas were small. Often is and partners to contribute to the conversation. So there is a role for facilitative leadership to be mainstreamed as an approach in all civil society organizations. You know, it's still not practiced broadly, right? It took me a long time to understand that. And also for a long time, people say, oh, we collaborate. Not really. Collaborate and partnerships are big, loose words, but I think really engaging each other in a very, very organic way is very much. Why does I think this, what I started to say earlier on, why does this matter and why is it urgent and pressing? I think the world is changing at a pace that's unprecedented, and it is now truly super exponential, really, really exponential. And it's racing at a speed that is beyond us. Technology has a part of it, climate change has a part of it. And as a result, what is our role in that system? And the only way and I remember this chart that came out of Forever Sabah around unknown unknowns and complexity, right? Systems are getting way, way more complex. And therefore, the only way forward is for more conversations with unusual allies with 50% of the, you know, even 30% of the data. Not 100% of the data, maybe only 20 to 30% for fast decision making and self-correcting approaches. You have to sort of self-correct and iterate really quickly. So I the way forward, definitely something more of us need to embrace, and more of us have to take on board. And I guess my own goal for the year is how do I get more funders, more resource providers to bring you to the table, to have you in this as a facilitative leader in those conversations, so new perspectives are shared and new decisions can be made together.
Hi Sumi, my name is Najib. Yeah, good afternoon. So my question is, do you know any example where facilitative leadership has successfully changed the system in our government? Yeah, do you have any example in our region in Asia or in Malaysia?
Terima kasih, Mas. Actually, that's a great question. In Indonesia, there is a wonderful Ashoka fellow, Ibu Nani Zulminani. She actually has joined Ashoka now. She started the movement for the empowerment of women as the head of the household. And she worked with women in rural communities, bukan dalam bandar besar, bukan dalam city, tetapi dalam kampung dan rural tempat di Indonesia. So she started the movement, it's called PEKA, for Indonesia to see women as an important asset in the family and in the community as head of the household. She's in her 60s, 50, 58, 59. She's a force of nature. She's a bit like Cynthia. and she's divorced, and and she has a hijab, and I love her to bits. But she's very compassionate, and she started mobilizing over 25 years at a grassroots level through facilitative leadership at a rural community level through her organization PECA to demonstrate that women are a powerful ally in the system and to see women as powerful. And she has many tracks. The PECA does a lot of programs: economic empowerment, education, livelihoods, etc. Now, in that work, she slowly started weaving her relationships with foundations and funders. So she's one of those amazing organizations that managed to build a really strong bridge with Ford Foundation, as well as DFAT, which is a Department of Foreign Aid from Australia, and brought funding in and grew her organization over 20 years. She also demonstrated through research the impact of their work. Eventually, in the last 5 years, she's been working with the ministry, with the evidence, because she has this wide network and jaringan of women of a head of households across 44,000 villages in Indonesia. The government had to give her a seat at the table, and the Ministry of Women and Community have now adopted some of the policy recommendation for the role of women in the community. So yes, I think there are many, many examples like that particularly in Indonesia. We have seen shifts happen. Also, another big one is India on education. Vishal, Cynthia, Vishal, Dream a Dream. Highly through facilitative leadership with the government of Delhi. And the minister, he found a powerful ally in the Minister of Delhi, in the Department of Education for Delhi. Her name was Atishi, and she was very visionary. And so Vishal, over 3 years, it went much slower. The world is moving much faster, but like what you do and what Vishal does, he moved slower, and he held space for facilitative leadership with the Minister of Education and the social entrepreneurs and other organizations. He collaborated with other organizations, and they have changed curriculum and changed policy, not only in Delhi government, but in 7 other states across India. So suddenly they were going very slowly for 3 years, but in the last 12 months, 18 months, they have taken off. So it's another great example of facilitative leadership.
I have a question about what kinds of challenges you faced when you were engaging in systems change, like either through Ashoka Foundation or in your life before, and like how you overcame them. Because you talked about the frustrations, but what are the techniques that worked for you?
It's a long ride. It's not a quick fix, right? The work that you do is a long, long ride, and often very, very lonely, right? So that's one frustration. The other one is it's always trial and error. There is never a silver bullet. If I look at the patterns for all the Ashoka Fellows, the big thing, we've released a report, and I can send this through to Cynthia to distribute to all of you. It is messy. It is constant experimenting, measuring, feedback, shifting, tweaking. The thing that you think matters, you'll have to shift again. So it is messy, and it's iterative. And the third thing is the people that have to give you the funding and the resources often are not as bold and ambitious as you are. So those are the 3 that I see. And that's why for the loneliness part of it, because your great question, Sumitra, about what is the solutions, right? I think for the lonely part of it, building platforms that allow for exchanges within your communities and with others matters. You know, finding your tribe matters, I think, in the systems work. And that's one. The second is, I think sometimes when you are trailblazers like you are, you might find that many people actually want to follow you and want to learn more from you. And there is something there from that process of also learning from them. And so like, when I think about what you do at Sabah, I can't help think, wow, the people in the Semenanjung and KL and all these places should really learn about what you guys are doing up there, right? So that is another way of sort of building camaraderie and building a tribe. The third thing for regarding iteration and changing, you know, I mean, this sounds maybe very banal, but I was very disappointed. I was very frustrated. I used to be overdriven. You know, I assumed everything was a straight line. So if I want to change, you know, like I was in education, so I said, oh, I want to train teachers. And then when that wasn't going fast enough, I would take it very personally. And I would get very frustrated with that, and then having to change the game again. And our teams often don't like changing. Teams don't like moving and reiterating very often. So there's a balance between understanding where you're at and the change that you're making, and then getting the feedback loops, the positive and negative feedback loops, to make the decision whether you need to pivot again. So you're constantly pivoting and refining. Being open to that, I think, is really important. And this is where the inner work also matters. It's not about your ego. It's not about what you're doing, how you show up. It's not somebody else's fault. Let's look at the model again, you know? So I think those are some of the things. And three is, you know, let's work more together to get funders to understand this, because your life could be much easier if funders came and said, here's $500,000 or $1 million for you to figure this out. And I will check in with you every 2 months and walk with you, you know? So I think we need to help funders see also how this work is so important. So the work that you do, documenting, researching, measuring, matters. And the storytelling part of this matters a lot. Too much for too long. Many of us are very good at the doing, but not so good at the measuring and the storytelling. And when we start measuring, we're always worried and we want to do the perfect answer. I think even the simple storytelling of the one shift that you created is very powerful. So I think that's something we might want to do more of together with funders to help them see how they can support you better.